Welcome everyone to our webinar today, Microsoft Flow to import and update content in SharePoint Online. My name is Ted Pattison and I work at Critical Path Training as a senior instructor, also writing most of the curriculum. Everything that we're going to do about this talk, I have the slides and some samples available for you in a GitHub repo. So if you navigate to this URL, what you can find is a slide that also has this URL already in place. And what I mean by that is here you're going to see that we have the slides. Some of the examples I'm going to show you with expressions, I've tried to put them into some text files here. Okay, one other thing to note, let me go back to the slides here, is that we have at Critical Path Training a 2-day deep dive into PowerApps and Flow, getting into, what I'd say is more technical training than some of the alternatives that you might find. If you like the style of training over the next hour, please consider looking into this 2-day course that drills down into PowerApps and Flow. Okay, now let's get started with just, as you're working with Flow, let's go ahead and ground ourselves into going back. And I just have a account that I use for one of our training classes. And here I've basically got an account that allows me to create some flows. And today what we're going to look at is some flows that interact between SharePoint and particularly SharePoint lists and document libraries and other places. Now we're going to create a couple flows and look at a couple existing flows over the next hour. And what's important is just some of the fundamentals. So every single flow that you create has to start with a trigger. That's the thing that starts the flow in its execution. And there's a couple different kinds of triggers. And after the trigger is a set of actions. Now, what's also important is that there's services. We have these things called connectors that allow us to read and write data to services. So in my first demo, what I want to do is I want to go to a custom web API that serves up customer objects, and to be able to write a flow that can basically pull back that data and write it into a SharePoint list. And so because we want to talk to all these different services, reading and writing data as we import and export, the connectors are important. So as long as there's connectors that are supported to your data source, everything's going to fit pretty nicely into the story. Okay, now if I create a new flow, let's go back and let's say that I want to create a new flow, and I'll create this flow from blank. And if I then once again click from blank, I guess the first time you click from blank, it says, no, don't you want to use a template? And then the second time it realizes that you're serious and you really want to create something from blank. Now, the first thing that we have to add into our flow is a trigger. Now, what types of triggers, do we have? If I go and look for something, such as, something that is scheduled or on a timer, you're going to see that it's not called that. But if I look at now the standard triggers of what's built in, and what we'll see here is that we have a recurrence. That's what I should have typed inside there. If you want to have a flow that executes once every 5 minutes, once an hour, once a day, that's your trigger type. Now, when you're working with SharePoint, it's also nice to use the automated flow trigger support. So for instance, when someone does something to a SharePoint list item, such as creates it, edits it, deletes it, you have a flow that can trigger because of that. Okay. Now also, I can create flows whose trigger is an incoming HTTP request. We're going to see an example of that. If you're working with Dynamics 365 with the Common Data Service for apps, also very good support for automated flow triggers. Now, as you're wanting to run flows on demand, or if you want to demo flows during a 1-hour free webinar, we use buttons quite often. And so we have both a flow button that's particularly usable from your mobile app. Now, once we've added in the triggers, the next thing is to add in actions. Now, it used to be about 4 months back and later, they used to basically have something that as you got down here, let's say I add my button, and then as I add a new step, they used to have something saying add an action or a condition. But what they decided is that any type of condition is simply an action. So now you're always adding a new action, and there is a set of control steps that you can add in. Okay, now there's also variables that you can add in as steps, and there's also data operations. So we're going to see some examples of using all these. All of these have, specific places, where we can use them. Okay, now another fundamental aspect of working with Flow is that there will be a trigger. And that trigger might be someone's just updated a SharePoint list item. So what you'll get is you'll get outputs from the trigger, that tell you what is the list URL, what's the list ID, what is the ID of the item. And now you start adding actions, and they can use the outputs of any step ahead. And also, they add their own outputs. So as you go further down inside the flow, there's just going to be more and more types of information that are available to you. Okay, now let's go ahead and do a first example. So what I want to do is I want to move over to the browser for a second, and I have a simple sample of a web API. So if I go to subliminalsystems.azurewebsites.net/API/customers, I just have a little demo web service, and it's demo because it's available via anonymous access. And so notice that if I say /API/customers, it's going to get, basically a list of customers. If I add in parentheses and then an integer value, notice that that will give me back one particular customer. Now, let's say that what we'd like to do is we'd like to create a random customer. Now, there's about 400 items inside of my particular list. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some kind of a random function inside there. So the first thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and use a compose. And so we're going to add a compose operation. And so what we're going to do is we're going to write an expression. And so what I'd like to be able to do, is come up with a random integer, between some particular set of values. So let's go ahead and say rand, and then, as I type in here, RAND, open, and then we'll say between 1 and maybe I'll just choose 380. That should give me enough. Okay, so that's step number 1. Step number 2, let's create a second compose operation. And for this compose operation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put together a URL. Okay, now this one is going to be a little bit longer. Let me go ahead and also give these a name. So if I come back here, I right click and I choose rename. And so get random number is what I'm going to start with. And now I have a input inside there. Okay, so now the second one is going to be, and I'll call this one get URL. And inside here, once again, I'm going to write an expression. Now, this expression is going to be a little bit longer. In fact, if I go ahead and we add this inside, what you'll find is that the experience here for being able to kind of put long things and then be able to add them back in and read them, isn't great. What we're waiting for is a better editor from the Flow team. In the meantime, what many of us do is just to, bring up Notepad or some other thing and edit the things that you have inside there. Okay, so let's say that we now have our URL. Let's go ahead and add our next step, which is going to be we want to send an HTTP request across the network to get this data. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to go ahead and do a get. What is going to be the request URL? And we'll just take the output from get URL inside there. Okay, now in our case right here, I've kept the demo simple, so I can leave it as a get. I don't have to put any type of headers or extra queries inside there. Okay, but now what's going to happen is our data is going to come back. Now, let's go ahead and save this as add new customer. Okay, and maybe we'll go ahead and test it. I'll go ahead and hit save. Now that we're going to hit save, let's go ahead and click on test. And so I'm not writing it anywhere, but what's really nice about running these is that you can kind of see your progress, and before having to complete it and push something into SharePoint, there's a way for me to kind of figure out that all this data came back. For instance, it ran this particular flow inside here. As it came back, I look at all this data and I kind of see that, okay, I got something back. That's great. Now, the next issue that we want to tackle is that we've got this HTTP data back, but what we'd like to do is we'd like to put it, in a JSON format so we can work with it directly as an object. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and pick JSON. There is a parse JSON data operation that we're going to add inside there. Now, what is the content? Well, it's basically going to be the body of the HTTP response that's coming back. Okay, next, here's where we need to do a little work, and in particular, we need to be able to describe the data coming back as a blob of JavaScript object notation. So if I can do this, I can now come back here, and there's a link, use payload to generate schema. Let's go ahead and add that inside there. Okay, and now that we've done this, let's go ahead and we basically can save our work, and we're going to add one more step. Okay, so now we're good to add something into SharePoint. Now back here inside of SharePoint, I have a customers list. It's just created from the contacts list type. So now that you've seen that, let's go back here, and our last step that we're going to have is basically to create item. And as I click on create item, well, let's create a SharePoint item. What is the URL to the site? Notice that sometimes Flow is good at bringing this back to you, and sometimes it's not. So today it's filling in my site address, but it can't see the list inside there. So I just have to go to enter custom list value and add in the title of the list, which in this case is customers. And notice that now that it finds it, we can go ahead. So now I have the parse JSON inside here. So what you can see is parse JSON has basically transformed this, into an object that makes it very easy for me now to go down here, and there's the first name, and now here is the company. Let's just kind of add in a little bit more data here. What map work phone over to business phone, and then finally we have the home phone inside here, and let's add an email address for good measure. Now let's go ahead and save. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and test our work. You can see that we have this set of different things that we're running. We want to go ahead and test our work. We'll go ahead and choose OK. And so now that we have done this inside here and run the flow, and now we'll go ahead and choose done. The flow ran successfully. And once again, I should be able to come back here and kind of see what we're doing. We're basically taking data that looks like this and pushing it, into the SharePoint list. If we go back to the SharePoint list and we refresh, hey, well, now there is a customer inside here. Great. Let's go back and do a little bit more testing. So let's go ahead and save my work here, and I'm going to run it one more time. Great. And then also, let's go ahead and I have add new customer. Let's run it one more time, just running it without having to open it up in the editing experience inside there. And what we should see is that now I have 3 different items that my flow is creating each time. Once again, it's reaching out across the network, pulling back some data, and writing it into a SharePoint list. Okay. Now, I wrote a couple of flow expressions along the way there. So flow expressions are tricky. Microsoft pitches the Power Platform as the no-code citizen developer platform. And, the idea is that we want most of what can be done to be able to be done by mere mortals, business people, and not require deep technical experience. I would say that Power BI and PowerApps are more successful at that experience. But as we start working with Flow, what I find is that just a lot of even mainstream tasks that you have to do, really kind of requires a lower level, kind of IT level or developer level knowledge. Okay, now what are some of the scenarios that we want to write flow expressions? Well, string manipulation, you saw my example generating a random number. There's also a function to create a GUID. You might want to convert between types, perform simple calculations, handling optional values. You'll see that a lot of flow expressions have the question mark in it, and it basically says if this is a null object, don't blow up, generally is what the question mark means. Okay. Now, also, we can start writing if-then statements. If I want to work with arrays, lots of what you'll find is common tasks. You have to drop down and work, with very low-level language. Now, what you'll see here, let's go back to that flow that I was working on. Let's go back and open this thing up inside here. And, you'll see that here is an expression. So basically, you click on expression, you type it in here, click on update, and it pushes inside there. You've also seen that, in cases like this, that you have something that's really long and they just, don't have a great editing experience yet. That's something that's going to come. But working something out in Notepad and pasting it in is something that's often done. Now, when we work with flow expressions, we're not working with the PowerApps expression language. Remember, PowerApps and Flow for their expressions are completely different. In Flow, we have something which is called Workflow Definition Language, or WDL. Flow has a big brother named Logic Apps for developers that work with Azure. It's a way to kind of use the same type of metaphor to, build tasks and flows and to be able to have them operate in the cloud. Okay, and both of them have the same language, WDL. Now, as we start writing expressions, you're going to find it's very finicky. First mistake, don't ever use a double quote. That is not allowed in WDL. That's valid. Basically single quotes. Now, the other problem is you're used to operators. So you have one string and then you say plus another string and that doesn't work. And you say, oh, well, okay, am I in C# or BB? Let's use the ampersand. That doesn't work either. So basically, there are no operators for things like strings and numbers. And so what that means is that if you want to concatenate things together, you have to call the concat function. So there is an example of calling concat with two arguments. You can say comma and add a third string, comma, add a fourth string. So concat takes as many arguments as you'll pass it, but once again, you have to, write that code, and most people don't expect that. Now, here's a couple different functions that are part of WDL. Things like concat, substring, replace. If you want a GUID, if you want to bounce something to upper, to lower, we're able to work with those inside there. Okay, now here's one that people say, oh man, you got to be kidding me. You can't say 2 plus 2. You have to say add 2 comma 2. So once again, they just do not have the overloaded operators that you're used to from just about every other language and expression language that you've used. So everything is very explicit in terms of calling functions. Okay, now we've added some SharePoint list items already. So I want to show a couple more examples. I'm probably going to do more opening examples and running things I've already put together instead of creating things from scratch, just because I want to go through quite a bit. But let's start with control of flow. So let's say that we have this case right here where I want to go through an existing SharePoint list. and I want to get at the items one by one. So let's go back to create from blank, and once again, my create from blank here is going to start with a button. And now as I start with a button, that just starts the flow. Nothing particular about the button other than it's easy to test. Okay, but now we're going to do a get items, which is going to pull back the items from that SharePoint list. So let's go back here and we'll say get items, and we'll point to that same list that we're loading some stuff into right here. Okay, and what is our list name? That list name is customers. Great. Okay, so let's go ahead, and now you have these items, and what would you like to do with those particular items? So I'm going to go ahead and save. And true, I'm just grabbing customers and not doing anything with them. Okay, but let's go ahead and run a test right here. And the reason is mainly because I want you to see what the output looks like at this point. So we'll go ahead and run this right here. And we'll say run this flow. And so now that we've done that, and we go back to items, and now we go back, and so the key thing here is that you have an object, and that object's top level and only top level property is value, and within value is this array of objects. Okay, so you have to basically start by looking at that. Now, let's say that I wanted to get at something inside there. So let's go ahead and new step, and let's go ahead and call a compose method here. And so let's say that, inside of this compose method, I wanted to get something inside there. And so if I look down here, notice that it's not showing me all the different things that it's showing me under get items, the individual item properties inside here. Let's say that I wanted to get something different. I wanted to get the top level. So notice that there's a body, get items, and value. Now, once again, the use of the question mark says if get items comes back with a null value, don't blow up trying to find value, just return a null value back. Okay. Now, if I wanted to get something, inside there, I could say body, get items, and now I can look at all the properties inside there, and I can say question mark value. And that basically gives me back an array of all the different things inside there. Okay, now let's say that as I go back here and we go into expressions and, once again, body and get underscore items, and note that the underlying step has a space. However, when we reference them, they always replace spaces with underscores inside there. Okay, so once again, so body get items, and now if I say hyphen value, that allows me to get one more second here. Okay, and well, basically, what I'm trying to get at here is, quite often you have to drop down to this level, and now that's the collection. If I say sub-0, I'm basically saying give me the first item in this SharePoint list of items, and now, since I'm at there, give me the ID. Okay, so once again, do you want the collection, which is value? Do you want just one item out of there? Okay, now now that we're kind of looking at this, let's kind of add some control of flow logic inside here. Now, one of the things that we have, if I want to enumerate through a list one by one, let's go back here, and I'm going to get rid of this. But let's say that what the purpose of this is going to be is let's enumerate through the customers list. Let's find all the different records there, and let's bounce company to uppercase. Okay. So just imagine there's something that you want to do to check values, and you run something once a day just as a data massaging technique. So here we can kind of start with this approach here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to say new step, and we're going to say update, and we're going to update a item. Okay, now if I want to update the item, there's update SharePoint item. And so first of all, we have to say, what is our site? Great. Now, what is our list? Once again, we're going to come inside here, and we have the customers list. Once we've got that, note that if I put my cursor in ID over here, get items ID. If I don't, I see all the other items. Now, what's kind of strange about this is how could it give me one of the IDs when I have multiple customers coming from get item? And the answer is that there's this productivity trick. When I add this inside here, it automatically throws me, into a apply to each. And so now what happens is you're looking at, one item at a time. Okay. Now, what I need to be able to do, is to be able to get last name inside here. So let's say that I go down here and I find last name. Great. And now down here, add dynamic content. There is the company. But I can add company, but I don't really need company. I need to upper company. And one of the things that you can try here, and this won't work, is to say to upper. Okay, now if I say to upper and I put the open paren inside here, and then I go back to dynamic content, and all of a sudden it's not giving me, the individual item. It's giving me the collection of items inside here. Okay, so what I have to know is that there is a item property, and by calling item, one of the things that we're able to do is look for something in particular. In our case, it's going to be company. Okay, so now that we've got that inside there, let's go ahead and choose OK. Let's go ahead and hit save. And this is flow number 2. But let's go ahead and save this inside here. Let's go ahead and test our work. So I'll go ahead and choose test. And before we run it, let's go see the before. They are not in uppercase right now. Let's go ahead and run. And the flow has started. Your flow always starts successfully. Will it end successfully is, a more important question. And now I kind of see, yes, it did run successfully. If I go down here, I can see, each one, what it did inside that work. There's number 1. I click on number 2. The proof is in the pudding, though. If I come back here to the SharePoint list and we refresh, okay. And now just kind of assume that, it's possible for you to write something that just walks SharePoint list items, once again, once a day, once an hour, once a month, how often you need to do it, just before year end, and is able to kind of do this type of work where you're able to kind of go through item by item and do whatever type of massaging that you want. Okay. Now, back here in the slides, what I just kind of showed is the apply to each. Let's look at a couple other examples. Sometimes you just want a condition, which is if this, do task 1, else do task 2. So we're able to use the condition action, and the condition action will basically branch off, into a yes and a no branch. Okay. Now, there's also the switch action. What would happen if you don't just have, 2 outcomes, but you have 4 outcomes? You could put a if-then inside of an if-then inside of an if-then, but it's going to be a lot easier to go with a switch action. And the idea is that when we say switch, you pass a value. If the value is A, here's an execution path. If the value is B, here's an execution path for that. Okay. Also, there's the terminate action. So you should be using that when appropriate, because then not only can you end, but you can end with confidence. And so notice that sometimes you want to terminate, so it's good to call succeeded. Arguably, if it doesn't fail, you're going to see that it completed and it completed successfully. But if you have something such as, we're going to send out an email about all the customers in this list, but what if that list is empty? Well, we don't need to send an email, but we do need to terminate, and we can terminate and say successful. Or once again, if you need to set a flag, you can terminate either as failed or canceled. Okay. Now, as we keep going through here, using variables, to track state, gets to be a valuable thing to do. Okay. Here's an example in the slide in front of you where I say get items, and then we initialize a variable, with the email address. And what we're able to do then, is to basically go through an entire set of contact items and take the emails and just basically put a semicolon in between them. So then I could basically just have a string, and I could just copy and paste it into my BCC line. Okay, now here's one we'll actually do a example of. So let's go back. And, currently you can see that we've got, this many. We've got 3 different customers here. Let's take those customers and go ahead and delete them. Never liked them anyway. Okay, now let's go back here to my flows. And inside of the flows, one of the things that you can do is, let's say that you have the add new customer. And so I'm going to go ahead and edit this, or not edit, but do a save as. And we'll say HTTP trigger to add new customer. So notice that when you create a flow by choosing save as, it's initially turned off. If I go ahead and I click on the flow page inside here, a little bit hard to see, but up at the top right, you have an on-off button. So the idea is that if you clone something, we don't want to have 2 events trigger on the same thing. So the idea is that it's not turned on until you have some time to go change it. But if you don't need to change it, you can turn it on right away. Now, what I want to do with this flow, let's go into edit, is let's go ahead and get rid of the trigger. Okay, so a flow has to have a trigger, but you can delete the trigger that's there and then add a new one. The flow is not valid until you add a new trigger, but let's go ahead and get rid of this right here. Okay, and now that we've gotten rid of that, I want to look for the HTTP trigger inside here. So built in, there is this when an HTTP request is received. So let's go ahead and add that trigger. Now, under Show Advanced Options, you have to set it to a basic mode of using gets. And note that we don't really know what this URL is going to be until we save. So let's go ahead and hit save here. So what I've done here, it's a little bit contrived, but what I've done is I've kind of taken an existing flow and I've made it so that we can basically execute it by executing this URL inside here. Let's go ahead and copy that URL. Now, let's go back over here. Here is a team site. Let's take this URL and let's put it inside here. And let's go ahead and run that inside here. And, as I run that, and now we go back here, let's see. Okay, and did I hit execute on that? Okay, so now we've kind of executed this, but the idea is that this incoming invocation, will trigger the flow running inside there. let's go back here, and you can see basically that, at this point, I'll hit refresh once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Let's go back here and refresh. So what's happening is every time that HTTP request comes in, it's basically triggering the flow from running. Okay, that leads into a trick I want to do. And the trick is, how can you have one flow execute another flow? Now, in the future, Microsoft has committed to giving me a more direct way to do that. But currently, what you have to do with the flow that you want to call is what I've just done, is give it an HTTP trigger. Now, let's go back here. And I'm going to go back to my flows. And let's go ahead and look at this one, which is create many customers at once. So I'm going to open this up right here. Now here, I basically got a flow button that has a integer parameter, so you have to add a number. Okay, next, we're going to initialize a variable. So we want the user to be able to say, I want 5 customers, and click on a button, and somehow I want to call that other flow 5 times. So we're going to basically initialize a variable, and the counter is going to be 1. Great. And now we're going to have a do until loop. And inside of our do until loop, let's go ahead and kind of close some of these things inside here. We're going to say we've created this variable, which is customer counter. Okay. And up here, there is an input by the user for customer count. So do until the customer counter is greater than the customer count. And inside here, we're going to basically call, into the other flow by calling that URL. Okay. And then afterwards, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use an increment counter. Okay. So now, once again, let's go back over here. Let's kind of test our work. Let's start just by deleting all my customers. At Critical Path Training, we treat our customers much better than this, but these aren't real customers. Let's go back here and kind of take this flow and test it. Okay, so we'll go ahead, we'll click test, and this time, when it says create many customers at once, let's create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's go ahead and choose run. And of course, the flow always starts successfully. Not always, but starting successfully, it doesn't mean that much. So let's go ahead and see if the flow is running. And it looks like, if I came back here, now I basically run that 7 times, by basically calling across and having one flow execute another, by doing it in the context with a counter variable. Once again, we start the loop by initializing an integer variable with a value of 1. I create the do until loop, and I basically have the upper and lower bound. And then inside there, well, we'll put together the URL, we'll create an item. If this was in SharePoint, we do this. But in our case, we did a little bit more, which was to, basically call out to SharePoint. I'm sorry, call out to the other flow, to do that work on our behalf. Okay, so let's go a little further here and talk about, processing data in different ways. So one of the things that you're able to do is transform an array. Now, where would you get an array? If you're dealing with a SharePoint get items step, it returns back an object with a value property. And what's in that value property? An array. Okay, now let's say that we go back here. And so what I'd like to do now is, let's say there's some data in a SharePoint list, and we'd like to take it and we'd like to put it, into a CSV file. So in our case right here, let me go ahead and open this flow up. We have a get items. Okay, now when get items comes back, what we're going to do is we're going to use a select. Okay, so the idea of the select is that we can basically say, take the value array, and I want to create a a new collection, but I want to define, what the column names are on this collection because I want to write it to a CSV file or I want to write it to an XML file. And so what we're able to do here, is take things that are actually on the list and basically kind of have them as inputs, to our select operation, and we can see what the output is right here. Okay. Now with this, let me go ahead and save. Let me go ahead and run a test right here. And as I run this test right here, let's go ahead and kind of look at the output, first of all, of get items. So when I look at get items, there is value, and then there's a whole bunch of data right here. What we'd like to do is to put this data into a far more manageable form. So we take customer data, and you can kind of see the inputs right here, and you can now see the output is just a set of objects, and every object has first name, last name, company, and email inside there. Okay, now the next step here, is to, if I go back into edit, there is a data operation called create CSV file. So once we create that, the last thing I need right here is a way to come up with a file name. So in our case right here, what we're going to do is we're just going to use this little trick. And yes, I know you cannot see that. So if I choose new and put this inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a file name, customers, and then I want to format date, and we have UTC now, which tells me the time. Except remember that is Greenwich Mean Time, not my time here on the East Coast. So there are various ways to do that. There's more robust ways to do that. If you don't want to hard code in its own, but here, just to get the main concept across, add hours, UTC now, -5. So back it up, if it's 5 p.m. in the UK, it's noon where I am. Okay, and then let's go ahead and format that and put CSV at the end. Okay, and after we've done that, let's go ahead and create a file. Create a file inside of our SharePoint site inside here. Okay, so each time I run this, we should be able to go back here into documents, and see the files that we've been creating inside here. Okay, now actually, I'm sorry, I think I might have misspoke there. Down here, create file, we're creating a file inside of OneDrive. Okay, so if I now go off to OneDrive here, sorry for jumping around, but let me quickly navigate over to OneDrive. And yes, OneDrive is ready. And now what you can see, is every time I run that operation, it's basically going to create a file inside here. If I open up that file just to kind of see what it looks like, you can see basically it's just a CSV file. And if I download it, you're going to see, it is, once again, a regular CSV file. You can basically, once you load it into Excel, you can put it back in columns. But another thing to point out here is the select operation allowed you to change the SharePoint site column names into any other names that you want, including ones that you find are more reasonable or more conformant with whatever your particular scenario is inside there. Okay, so once again, working with arrays gets to be a pretty important thing to be able to do. Now imagine a scenario where you have a SharePoint list with contacts, and you've done some filtering, and you basically have 20 or 30 contacts, and you just want to basically pull out their email addresses and put them on the BCC line. So what you need is a semicolon delimited list of email addresses. So I call get items to bring back that array of SharePoint list items. We then use select to pull out one column, the email address, and create a string array, and then we use join to parse them together into a single string that's semicolon delimited. And all of a sudden, I have a flow that can send me an email or some other way, produce what I need to basically put something on the BCC line or even to automate sending the email out myself. Okay, you've seen a couple examples of using compose to construct some kind of a value, maybe parse together a string. But you can also use compose to create a JSON or JavaScript object notation object. And what's nice about doing that is that if you create it, you can send JSON to other applications, but also once you create an object in JSON, that is the native object format of PowerApps and Flow. And now on to another example. Let's work with this flow, save new SharePoint customer as JSON. So we're going to begin by having a step or the trigger, which basically gets the item from a SharePoint list just after it is created. Okay, once we've got that one particular item, remember the trigger's got the outputs that's going to hand us all the data that we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and compose a object. Notice that I'm picking object instead of one of the primitive values, as I use compose. And one of the things I'm able to do is pull data dynamically from that SharePoint list item and parse it into the JSON fragment that I'm creating. Now let's say I want to save this as a file into a document library. So now we need to come up with a file name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the trigger body and get the first name. And I want the last name, but remember with SharePoint, there's that little curveball where the title site column is renamed with its display name to last name. So it's the site column name title that matters. And once we've gotten the title column together with the first name column, we're able to generate a file name. And then we simply use a create file action, which is going to allow me to create a file in the SharePoint site. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our customers list. Let's go ahead and call new. And just as any normal average business user would, we'll enter in some data here. So Ted, and what is my last name? It is Pattison, ted@tedpattison.net will suffice for this. The company known worldwide is CPT. Okay, we'll go ahead and click on save. So right now, that trigger should be executing my flow. I come back to the documents document library, I do a refresh, and there is the JSON file that we've just created inside there. Okay, so you see how easy it is to create arbitrary JSON on the fly. If you're old school and you like Elvis and the Platters and working with XML, you can put together an XML file, you just have to parse it together as a string. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Now talking about converting between types, and that's one of those things that kind of moves you into a developer-esque territory. So as far as handling conversions, there are some that are converted implicitly. Other times you have to explicitly call a function. Now I wanted to provide a matrix for you to kind of show you what types conversions are going to happen implicitly, which ones require an explicit function, and which ones just aren't possible, as in you can't get there from here. If you're using Flow to build general business solutions, no doubt you will soon encounter the need to switch between time zones and deal with date-time formatting. So what you'll see is that everything starts at Greenwich Mean Time, and it's likely you'll be in a time zone that differs. So being able to call UTC now, add or subtract hours to compensate for your time zone, and also calling format date time using familiar format codes is another thing that you're expected to know. Okay, now in our last demo, we're going to use the data URI to binary function in Flow. And the reason for this is that PowerApps alone has trouble being able to upload a camera image taken with a mobile device to a SharePoint document library. It just doesn't have the compatible types for the SharePoint file connector. So what we're going to do is we're going to have PowerApps pass the data to Flow. Flow is going to perform the conversion to convert the file format that your mobile camera uses to a format that we can pass up into a SharePoint document library. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, there's me, hi. I'm going to create a quick application. I'm just going to start from blank. I create a camera control and an image control, and then I'm going to use that little trick that when we take a picture, what we're going to be able to do is then handle the event when a picture is taken. So in PowerApps, when you're developing, you click on the camera that takes the picture on select fires, and we're going to basically copy the photo up into a variable called last photo. Okay, and then we'll basically go to the image itself, and it will look at that same variable, last photo. Okay, now we'll go ahead and do a little test. We'll run the application. I'll click on it. I'll take another picture. You can see that the PowerApps end is working. Okay, now notice that we're going to add a button. And when we add this button, the point of it will be to give the user a command to take the last photo and save it up to a SharePoint document library. Now, here's the part where PowerApps would have trouble with alone. So we're going to call flow, but we haven't written a flow for this yet. So let's go ahead and we're going to move over to Microsoft Flow. Now, we're going to create a flow, and the trigger is going to be a PowerApps button. The PowerApps button provides a nice flexible way to pass parameters from the Canvas app to the flow, and you'll see that in just a second. Okay, once we've created the PowerApps button trigger, the next thing we'll do is add a compose action to create the file name. Now I could type this out by hand. I'm a lazy old salty dog. So what I'm going to do is, let's first of all get the right action. Let's add a compose action. And then we need to write a formula. I'll change the name to file name, but as I write my formula, I'm going to duck into my demo cheater file and get a concat that basically calls a GUID. We don't want to use the whole GUID. Let's only use 8 characters to get that uniqueness. But it will be photo-partial GUID dot, and then we'll have the file extension at the end inside there. Okay, and then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to add the create file action. Now, I just remembered I got to create a document library in SharePoint for this demo. So let me quickly jump over to SharePoint. We're going to say add an app, and we're going to add a special type of document library known as a picture library. So when we upload the images, they'll be instantly viewable. Makes a much better demo. Okay, so basically we've created a new picture library in SharePoint, which is called Photos. Now back in Flow, we're going to add the create file action. We'll basically point to our SharePoint site. We'll now look for and resolve the target path to the Photos document library. Great. Now, once we've got photos for the file name, we basically already got a compose output that gives us that. And now for file content, here's a little trick. Notice that you put your cursor into file content, and then we're going to go ahead and select that one particular item in the dynamic content pane, which is Ask in PowerApps, and that creates a parameter. Now we can't use the parameter directly because of incompatible types. So what we're going to end up doing is, once we've kind of added that and created the parameter, now we're going to use the data URI to binary function to do the conversion. So inside, what we're going to do is we're going to go and click on the expression tab. We're then going to, use that data URI. So data URI to binary, and let's go ahead and type in, I can't remember what that is, but now I can go back to the dynamic content, click, and automatically add that in, and there's what I need. Okay, so let's go ahead and name this Bob's Your Uncle for no good reason. Let's go ahead and save, and now let's go back and wrap things up. Back into PowerApps. So now we've got the picture library. We've got the flow that knows how to take what PowerApps hands over to it and basically upload it to that image library. And finally, we'll connect this button. So with that particular button, we'll go to Actions. We'll go ahead and click on Flows. And what you're going to see is all the flows that are in the same environment. So remember to make sure that the Canvas app that you've created and the flow you've created are in the same environment. But basically, you're going to see anything that has the PowerApps trigger, the PowerApps button as its trigger. Now, this is not going to be complete until up here, Bob's Your Uncle, we go ahead and call run. So what are we going to pass it? We're going to pass it that last photo. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and run this right here. Okay, one more time, I'll go ahead and wave at you. Not a great picture, but hopefully the information here is better than the visual imagery. Before we click the button, we'll go back over here. Okay, great. Let's now one more time go back here. Let's go ahead and click the button. And now we see these little dots going across the side. And if things are good, we should be able to go back here. And after a second, maybe we'll have to do a refresh. But there's the picture right there. Okay, let's test it out. Back here, let's go ahead and now do something really funny. And now go ahead and click that. Once again, we'll take a couple more action pictures and go ahead and send those in. And what we should see here is that, as I'm taking the pictures, they keep going up inside there. So now I've just kind of created a Power App using Flow to mainstream having some type of mobile device-based Canvas app that basically streamlines uploading documents or images in particular to a SharePoint document library. Okay then, well that's our program for today. I'd like to thank you all for attending, spending a little time, and letting us teach you about managing and updating content in SharePoint Online using Microsoft Flow. Remember that there is a GitHub repository I told you about at the beginning of this webinar, github.com/criticalpathtraining/advanced flow expressions. And in that repository, you'll find the slides that I used today, and you'll also find some of the demo files. Also, if you're in the mood for 2 days of in-depth training with hands-on labs to really get what we've talked about here under your fingertips, please consider taking our deep dive into PowerApps and Flow. If you take a quick trip to the Critical Path Training website and you drop down courses, you'll find the deep dive into PowerApps and Flow. And here, what you'll see is that you can see the course agenda. You can see the description of each lecture if you'd like to look at what are the topics of each lecture or what are the lab exercises. So here's a hands-on class. If you're interested in more hands-on, note that we are offering the next delivery on February 14th, Valentine's Day, because I know all of you are completely in love with Power Apps Flow and the Power Platform.